Hello and welcome. You're watching Head to Head. I'm Carrie Oderman with UATV. The European Court of Human Rights has completed a preliminary hearing on the case Ukraine versus Russia regarding human rights violations by the Russian occupation regime in Crimea. The dispute centers on Moscow's violations of European conventions in occupied Crimea since late February 2014. Inhumane treatment and torture and limitations put on freedom of religion and the right to education, among other infringements, are the topics of the case. Kyiv also accuses Russia of being responsible for the deaths of Ukrainian military servicemen, law enforcement officers, and civilians. To discuss this, we welcome to our studio today Tsymbrivsky, head of USAID Human Rights in Action Program. Hello, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Hello.
Now, we're talking about the European Court of Human Rights. Neither Ukraine nor Russia belongs to the EU. And the question is really of jurisdiction. Explain to our viewers how this works.
European Court of Human Rights is a bit different body, which is not affiliated to European Union because it was installed under the auspices of Council of Europe in order to monitor the European Convention on Human Rights, party to which and signatories are both Ukraine and Russian Federation. So this gives the preliminary basis for the possible jurisdiction for the court to view this case on possible human rights violations on the territory of occupied Crimea. So far, the court should assess its jurisdiction to this case. That's why this is preliminary hearing, and afterwards it might go inside the merits of the case. That's why it's very important stage of the litigation which is ongoing in European Court of Human Rights, one of many actual litigations in the legal domain in order to enhance Russia's accountability for human rights violations in eastern Ukraine and in Crimea, and I feel quite optimistic about the future developments in the preliminary hearings. Actually, in half a year or a year, we will get the decision of the court whether it should look into the subject matter of the case or not, but I feel quite optimistic that the decision would be to the side of Ukraine, and afterwards it will deal with more specific issues which are related to human rights abuses. Moreover, these are large-scale human rights abuses which took place starting from 27th of February, at least, as Ukraine is asserting the responsibility of Russian Federation. In the case, unlike Russian Federation is neglecting this approach, of course, because it is stressing that it is responsible for human rights situation in Crimea starting from 18th of March 2014. And it is quite ridiculous because before Russian Federation emphasized that it is responsible for human rights situation in Crimea starting from 21st of March 2014. So these are the 2 days which are connected with the signature of the Treaty of Union between so-called Republic of Crimea and Russian Federation, and the latter is referring to taking in force of the treaty. And that's why the representative of Ukraine was very masterful in trolling the counterpart of Russian Federation.
Now, that would be Ben Emerson yesterday?
Yes, pressing him to choose which specific date Russian Federation meant. So Russian Federation is very loosely playing with the dates which are very crucial for the litigation. And this is, of course, indefinitely a very weak point which should be leveraged by Ukraine, and it was very successful in this respect, and we will see what will happen further on, of course.
We have a clip from Ben Emerson. Let's take a look.
Mr. Swainston asks, what's the pattern? What's the unifying feature? The targets of Russia's campaign of human rights violations and persecutions have one thing in common. They were all actual or perceived opponents of Russia's illegal occupation.
Now, as you mentioned, this hearing was preliminary. Once the jurisdiction is established, will it matter? How can the court make Russia comply with what it decides?
The next stage will deal with the merits of the case, namely large-scale human rights violations which occurred on the territory of the occupied Crimea and fall under the scope of the European Convention of Human Rights. This is the prohibition of torture, life to liberty, and some other instances of human rights abuses which would be evaluated by the court in terms of the provided evidence by the both parties, and this is quite crucial. And of course here I do not feel very optimistic and positive, since the key issue at hand is that how much court will satisfy all of the claims which were suggested by Ukraine before the court, but still I guess that the majority of them would be quite successful, because the data Ukraine has at its disposal, and also the assessment which has been done so far by the international institutions is a very extensive one to look at, and also many of the things coincide with each other, so they are quite credible. Unlike Russian Federation was trying to undermine the authority of international institutions yesterday, including some of NGOs, namely the NGO which I'm representing right now, Ukrainian Helsinki Human Rights Union. It was mentioned during the litigation, so my response to that this is the best reward we could ever get for our involvement into the issues of human rights abuses. But if answering more seriously, so it could be assessed with other findings in order to avert any suspicion of the biased nature of our findings. That's what Russian Federation was trying to do, depicting Ukraine and its so-called allies, West and the US, as into the one basket, and naming them that they are very interested to suppress Russian Federation. But this is not the first instance of such a behavior from the Russian Federation. Of course, the position is not a flawless one on the part of Ukraine. There are many things which could be really put into doubt. For example, some of the statements which were voiced yesterday, of course, more relating to the political sphere, but very sensitive. At least it is the unconstitutional Ukrainian government which took power back in 2014, when Ukrainian president has stepped down not in accordance and not in line with the provisions of constitution. That means that the only legal way to push down Yanukovych at that time should be impeachment. So this is only one of the instances which could be involved in this matter. But generally, of course, this is quite obvious that Russian Federation was trying to label this case as a purely political one, which has nothing to do with human rights. But of course, I'm more than sure that this will not be taken into account by European Court of Human Rights, since it has a very generous practice in this regard, especially with regard to the situations which relate and amount to occupation. And this is the case to deal with here, since the main battle is about the date of occupation. Ukraine is pressing the date 27th of February, Russian Federation 18th of March. Now, I guess this is the last date to be involved, so we will see which date will look into court, taking account all the circumstances. It is a very complicated case. We should be aware of this fact, and that means that some years will take to deal with the merits of the case. We could recall the other jurisprudence of European Court of Human Rights and related cases, for example, Transnistria case, or the case related to Georgia yeah. or Turkey and Cyprus in terms of the situation of Northern Cyprus. So the latter, it took around 40 years in order to produce the judgment, and also to to seek for the compensation as such. So we should be quite patient. I know it might sound very irritating, but it is the proper way to deal with this issue in terms of the legal domain. And I'm more than sure that this is what should be done. Although I have a lot of reservations about meddling of political sphere into the legal domain, and one of the brightest examples is the situation with the release of Ukrainian sailors, which should have been released unconditionally, but nevertheless it was not the case, and they were a part of the political bargain and deal. And yesterday's hearings are also indicating about this approach, which might have been taken by new Ukrainian administration, which is not that harsh into its approach to Russian Federation. As parties stated in their answers before the court, they said and mentioned about the so-called normalization between two states, and specifically mentioning the political prisoners and other detainee swap, which occurred days ago. So I'm afraid that the political intrusion, it moves faster than the legal domain, as I have mentioned.
It sounds like we have to play the long game. Now it's a matter of time and dates, and unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us. I would love to have you back. That was Taras Tsymbrivsky, head of USAID Human Rights and Action Program. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more.